Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined once again by Chris Lee.
Hi there.
Good to have you back on, mate. And I'm also joined by Alex Wilson, who is involved heavily in the fan movements at Dulwich Hamlet. Alex, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's good to have you on, mate. Thanks very much for joining us today. And today we are going to be talking about the history of the ultras movements, fan movements, supporters groups, and everything to do with fanatically supporting your football team, specifically focusing on ultras movements and all of the different heritage implications surrounding them, such as identity, expression, football culture, and how heritage actually plays a part in how they really conduct themselves both on the terraces and off of it. Obviously, Chris Lee has been in this podcast a number of times before. Our listeners will be well aware of him. He is the founder of Outside Right, which is a football, travel, politics and history blog and podcast. He's a groundhopper and a football traveller himself, and he's very au fait with the origins of the ultras movements and the origins of football in general. Alex is new to the show, however. Alex, if you want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself just before we get things started properly.
Yeah, sure. My name is Alex. For about 10 years now, I've been quite heavily involved on the terraces at Dulwich Hamlet, and more recently, a couple of years ago, I've become more involved in the Supporters Trust. I'm an elected member of the Dulwich Hamlet Supporters Trust board, and I think, there's been a lot of column inches devoted to the history of Dulwich Hamlet and what's going on there over the last decade or so, but I think there's something interesting that's happened at Dulwich, which has seen a sort of a new kind of way of or a new kind of format of supporting on the terraces develop that's kind of a spillover from people who feel very alienated with the clubs in the Football League pyramid, particularly the Premier League. And we're also a club that's kind of faced our own challenges with creating an atmosphere. When I first started going about 10 years ago, there were about 800 people on the terraces. You knew everyone. It was very easy to kind of make a racket and create an atmosphere to support the team. And then almost overnight, those attendances leapt up to about 3,000 people. There's a lot of tourists and day trippers, and they're great, and we're very happy to have them there supporting the club. But that obviously dramatically impacts the ability of the fans to create an atmosphere on the terraces. So there's been a lot of work done kind of at the coalface to try and recreate the atmosphere and something either similar to what it used to be or something perhaps even better and new to what we had before. So yeah, it's been an interesting experience kind of firsthand working out as a football supporter tactically, what are the things that you do to try and create a better atmosphere.
Can I just vouch for that as well? Because I used to be a local and I lived in Streatham for many years and went to Dulwich Hamlet in the 2000s, and it was, like I said, not quite, one man and his dog type thing, but it was very traditionally non-league, wasn't it? And then having moved out of London and then go back sporadically, see the crowds grow, the atmosphere grow, the visibility of stickers and banners and everything like that. It does have a, I guess, European aesthetic than a lot of other clubs, especially in the non-league. And it's great to see so many women fans as well and young fans, which you don't necessarily get in non-league football. So yeah, kudos to everyone at Dulwich Hamlet for making a great effort there.
I'd say so. I think what's happened at Dulwich has been really well publicised, really well wrote about over the last few years as well, as being this kind of flourishing and burgeoning ultra scene. But like you said, Alex, not necessarily tied to just an ultras movement. It's an alternative football. Just by the way, Chris, sorry, I didn't mean to steal your introduction from you earlier on. You've been in this podcast so many times before.
Yeah, sure.
Our listeners probably all know who you are as well through your work. Obviously, you've been doing this for quite a long time. Sorry about that.
All right. You forgot to mention the 3 books, by the way.
I did forget to mention the 3 books, and I'm kicking myself now for forgetting to mention the 3 books.
The 3 books are Origin Stories of Pioneers Who Took Football to the World, The Defiant History of Football Against Fascism, which does have some ultras stories in it. And also the Shades of Green, Journey to Irish Football, which also has ultras in it. And I'm sure we'll touch on Irish ultras, actually, because League of Ireland, at time of recording, League of Ireland kicks off this week. So
that's right.
There we are.
Yeah, exactly. I've read 2 out of 3 of those books and they were fantastic. So I'm sure the third one, which was actually your first book, Origin Stories, will be a terrific read as well. So I'd urge any of our listeners to go out and buy those books, and we'll include links to go and purchase them in our show notes for this episode. But in terms of what we're talking about today, I think there's, first of all, some important, housekeeping that we need to do in terms of how we define ultras, what ultras movements are, and really as a kind of wider movement, what ultras actually is, because it often gets mixed up with the casual movement, the hooligan movement, and a number of other different football movements, football protests as well. Like Alex said, supporters trust. And while ultras can often be involved in all of those things. They're completely different groups of people. They're completely different groups of movements and individuals, and they operate differently from each other, and their intentions are different from each other, importantly.
Yeah. So ultra itself is a Latin word for, extreme or to go beyond, effectively. And when you see ultra movement that emerged in Italy in the late 60s, early 70s, during this years of lead, gli anni di piombi, which is the post-economic miracle kind of collapse of Italian industry, and lots of what was happening on the street suddenly transferred to the stadium, and originally as a sort of left-wing movement, effectively. But that did, as you can imagine, for Italy, has kind of moved rightwards in a lot of cases. But you can get an instance because the curva is a bit behind the goal, as anyone familiar with Italian football will know. That's where the ultras will gather, and there's room enough in Italy, especially for 2 or 3 different ultra groups of different leanings to gather in there, as is the case at places like AS Roma. What we're looking at with ultras is where it differs, as you mentioned, from casuals and hooligans, and Barra Brava, if I might throw them in, from the South America, or Torcida in Brazil, is that you've got, with ultras, you're talking about putting on display that supports the team. Ultimately, the team is first, the club. It's all about the identity, possibly of the town as well, and that links very much to, in Italy, especially with the philosophy of campanilismo, which is like, your town, the campanile is the bell tower. Your town is the most kind of important thing compared to anything else. Where in the UK, it's slightly different. You've got, you're based near Glasgow, but your Celtic fans, Celtic supporters can come from all over. Likewise, a lot of Manchester United fans in the southeast of England. So it's not quite the same sort of link to the town that you in the UK as you get, say, in Italy, where it's all about the town. The creation of banners and flags came with it. Obviously, the aesthetic of the flags, the flares, the stickers, sporadic protests influence over the running of the club. So it's all about the supporting of the club. Often the chants will be led by a capo, as it's got the head, as it's known in Italy. And ultra fans often highly organised, often with a hierarchy in the most extreme cases, especially if there's violence involved, and we'll talk about the overlap with hooliganism shortly, then that can be enforced quite strongly. Where that difference from hooliganism, whereas football was kind of I'll say accidental. I think the societal issues in the 60s to the 80s that happened in the post, again, similar to Italy, post-industrial decline in the UK led to anger in the streets, especially with men being put out of work. So you've got angry young men looking for an outlet, and that outlet would often be violence in or around football rather than actually the football being the thing itself. But it does link to identity in some ways. Obviously, you have the establishment of firms, etc. Now, where casuals comes in, casuals is more kind of like when the hooligans realised that when they were wearing club colours that were getting identified quite easily by the police, they thought, okay, we need to blend in, wear higher kind of value clothes. It's kind of like if you know type situation where there'd be a code in what kind of sportswear you'd wear, like Fila, Sergio Tacchini, Fred Perry is another one that's quite famously get associated with a Burberry, I suppose, as well. So this was kind of where casuals came in. They're more about the visual aesthetic as well as the football and in some cases the fighting as well. Barra Brava is very different, where some ultra groups, especially in Italy and other places, can be linked with organised crime. In South America, the Barra Brava quite often are, and it gets a complex. We're not really covering them today, and I guess they're more sort of similar to the Sorcida. But the key thing want everyone to notice is when football started in the 1860s, as association football was codified and started playing in the 1850s, 60s. The original plan was it's just like for rich men, gentlemen who don't have to work to go and play, the games that they're used to playing at school, their private schools. Whereas, the working class, working man in particular, women later, did not have the opportunity to play or watch football at this point. So it was very much not designed for people to watch. So in the 1870s, when the liberation of workers' rights, you can suddenly get a weekend, you get half a Saturday off, they could go and watch football, and then you see the changing of the guard slowly over time. So in the 1880s, you start 1883, we see the FA Cup final, the last time that the I suppose the old Etonians is the losing finalists to Blackburn Olympic, the first sort of northern and working class team to win it, and that is the first time that a northern and working class team wins it, and the last time that we see the influence of the private schools and the people that have gone before, the Royal Engineers, Oxford University, these sort of independent clubs like Clapham Rovers, I think, won one, didn't they? That's it for the FA Cup, and it's now a working class game, at least in the terraces and on the pitch. if not in the boardroom and in the association as well. So that's how football fandom kind of emerges as a thing, but it's not. And we first sort of start seeing organised political football violence in the 1890s in places like Belfast, where you've got sectarianism and things like that. And people are singing songs at this point. They are singing like ballroom songs that kind of like concert hall songs that people are familiar at the time. That's where you get people like, songs like West Ham singing "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles" and kind of old school songs that we wouldn't necessarily come across nowadays, except in that context. But football fandom does develop independently in different countries and don't know what's going on in South America at this point.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking we'll come to the first hincha, Frente Reyes, soon, I'm sure. But that's kind of just to so we know from a nomenclature point of view how ultras different from hooligans and casuals and barra brava and torcida. And I hope that has in a nutshell dispelled how the five different sort of definitions of groups that are out there.
It's a whistle-stop tour.
I was just going to say, I think in particularly English context, I've always personally been kind of really interested in the actual paucity of vocabulary we have to describe our own fan scene and how fuzzy some of the definitions are. Because if you go to Italy and you refer to the ultras, I think everyone knows what you're talking about. Whereas in England, we know there's different types of fans, and we know when we see them, right? Each stadium will have fans who are more likely to be on their feet, more likely to be singing, more likely to be cheering. We don't really have a word for them, and I'm not sure they'd necessarily fit your typical definition of ultras. And I mean, certainly at Dulwich, and I imagine we'll talk about this later, but it's been a word that people have always been a bit unsure about using, because the fans that I kind of watch the game with, we're the active ones. We've got drums, we've got banners, we're supporting the team. If someone referred to us as ultras, you'd probably go, yeah, I guess we fit that definition. But also in this country, it's got connotations of violence, of links with organised crime, of drug dealing and stuff, which I can categorically say is not what I'm involved with at Dulwich Hamlet. So it's difficult. So what word should you use for the people who are the noisemakers is an interesting question in England. I don't think there's a good answer for it.
No.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think there's some really important points being raised there, though. Like Chris, like you said, ultras movements have evolved differently in different countries because ultras movements, like football, are a reflection of the society around them in many ways. Mm-hmm. And ultras movements most of the time are a reaction to that society, and we'll talk about why that is later on, which is why you've got the Barras Bravas in Argentina, the Torcida in Brazil, and then ultras movements on mainland Europe, which are completely different from the ones that we know, even in Scotland, even in the rest of the United Kingdom, is that they're completely different because of the circumstances and the conditions that they evolved around. But importantly as well, what you mentioned earlier on is that ultimately ultras movements are born out of these really strong links to place, the place which then informs the identity and the football club. And they all kind of really nicely come together in this sort of Venn diagram where the ultras movement is well in the middle. And this is where heritage comes into it. Is that I think it would be fair to say that many ultras movements see themselves as the extension of the football club, and by extension, the identity of the football club. And that's what they're trying to express on the terraces and off of it as well. But it is quite interesting how, like, in Italy, you have this idea of the bell tower defending your town, defending your area. Whereas in the UK, it's a little bit different because you can have generational support. Say if a family member has moved away, sometimes that can stretch all over the world, and it becomes a little bit muddied as to maybe the sense of place isn't strong, but it's more a sense of identity and roots and origins as opposed to anything else. So ultras movements are different at every single football club, of course, but in every single country, ultras movements have evolved differently and behaved differently and have grown up differently because... And at the end of the day, that's kind of just how it is, really. I suppose those are the conditions that we found ourselves in, and that's how they've evolved based on the surroundings that they've found themselves in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's also fluid. You have to remember it changes. So I was in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago at the time of record, and people associate FC Barcelona with Catalanism because they were the most well-known symbol of Catalan identity that's out there. Purely, they've got the aesthetic in the badge, the crest, the captain's armband, everywhere, Catalan flag or the señora, and within the stand you'll see that flag. However, over time, obviously, Barcelona's become more expensive to get to. A lot of fans have drifted towards barrio clubs. Barri in Catalan is the suburb, the neighbourhood. Places like Europa, which people may not know, is the third club of Barcelona after Barcelona and Espanyol. And they were a founder member of La Liga back in 1929, but they're kind of in the third tier now. And they're from the town called Gracia, which was absorbed into Barcelona. They're very much saying, we are from Gracia, we are not from Barcelona. And so it's a bit the same way that Dulwich was absorbed by London, I suppose, but it's kind of like very much its own sort of identity and village, and looks very different to the other neighbours around it. But then you've got Sant Andreu, which is in the division below them, and they literally wear the Senyera on their shirt, so the flag of Catalonia. And so you get these symbols, and you, rather than just the Senyera, you've got the Senyera Estelada, which is with the star on it, which is the independence movement for Catalonia. So it's not just, hey, we're Catalan. It's like, hey, we're Catalan and we'd like to be independent, please. Because that's inspired by the flag of Puerto Rico and Cuba, which have the blue triangle and star in them, and they get independence from Spain. So that's where that particular aesthetic comes from. But these little symbols that you get within neighbourhoods, as expressed through the football of the barrio, kind of tells us a lot about time and place.
Exactly. And on a similar note, like what's happened at Celtic this season with the Green Brigade being banned for, I think it's 56 or 57 days now. The atmosphere in Celtic Park has been pretty grim, and need to give credit to boys who are our other ultras group as well, who've taken some of the banned Green Brigade in to stand and sing with them, who've created a great atmosphere in their section and done their best to try and get the rest of the stadium to join in. But I think a lot of the crowd at Celtic Park have been showing up as being pretty casual. Previously, the Green Brigade and the boys were the real drivers of the noise that was going on in the stadium. And now that one of those groups is gone, it's seen to not be the case. So, credit to boys for doing their best to obviously do that. But a lot of people have came out and said the atmosphere isn't what we thought it would be, so it was less scary. So although, our ultras have done their best to try and kind of bridge that gap, I think our support have been showing up as being pretty toothless without the Green Brigade. So it's really interesting to see how much ultras groups actually drive the heartbeat of the stadium.
I think that can be the risk of letting one curva or tribuna or fondo, as they call it in Spanish as well, take over the decisions about who makes what noise. Because I've been in German matches where it's literally one end making all the noise, and sometimes the side stands where the fee paying people with the children and the older people are sort of like sometimes clap and join in very politely. Whereas I think in England, at least with and some clubs in Scotland where they don't have sort of ultras dominating, it's a bit more organic. So a chant can start from anywhere, usually the usual suspect blocks. If I think about Queen's Park Rangers, it's usually sort of either the loft, which is the members stand, or the PQ and R blocks, which are kind of like in the corner of the Ellerslie Road stand. That's where a lot of the noise comes from, and it does spread quite quickly. People feel like can get involved. I think if you've got an ultra group doing things, quite often it's just left to them, and people feel maybe they don't. But that's just a point of view.
I think there's something quite interesting to be said there, and I've sort of been watching the SPL a bit more this season because the title race is very interesting. And I was actually at the Hearts versus Celtic game recently as a sort of quasi-neutral. I'm not a Hearts fan, but I was very much hoping they would win. Sorry, Rory. And I thought the dynamic in the stadium was really interesting because you've got their sort of small, very nascent ultras group.
Gorgie Ultras, yeah.
Gorgie Ultras, who are some young lads who are just doing classic ultras things and, playing drums and singing throughout the entire match. But it sometimes felt that they existed in their own bubble and didn't really connect with the rest of the stadium. Whereas there was all of the stadium-wide chants started in the other corner, which was from a much more traditional style of support. And I sometimes feel like these ultras groups, especially when they're, quite young groups of lads who are just having fun with their mates, they don't understand the PR job that needs to be done within their own fan base and the need to kind of win hearts and minds with the rest of the fan base to kind of earn the right to be seen to be speaking on behalf of the whole fan base and try and get the other fans in. I think it's no coincidence that the Italian groups are very famous for a lot of the charity work that they do, which I'm sure has very good intentions, but also does the effect of giving them that credibility with the wider fan base and building the relationships within the wider fan base first. You can't just go into a stadium and expect the entire stadium to follow your lead. You have to earn that kind of position of leadership and respect.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because you could point to Crystal Palace, an example of that. With the Homestyle fanatics are, I don't say divisive, but it's like some, I think it's like Marmite. Some people like them, some don't. But I went to the match immediately after the Palace FA Cup win, so last home game of the season, and that was one of the best atmospheres I've ever seen in England. But basically, I think everyone was on a high anyway because the Palace just won their first ever trophy. But like the Homestyle was obviously leading the chants. They've got chants that come from other countries that wouldn't necessarily people would know, like Bella Ciao, for example, which is a tune that people in England wouldn't necessarily know unless you follow Italian football culture, but then they've got other ones more familiar, and then a lot of people joining in. So for one of the first times I can remember in English football, all four sides were joining in at those songs that everyone university knew. And it's very rare you get that, even in the continent or anywhere really, that all four sides are almost as loud as each other. And that was phenomenal.
Of course, it's taken them 20 years to get there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Really good point. So, and I'm really glad that you actually mentioned the Gorgie Ultras, Alex, because like Block 7, who are the Hibs Ultras, they've done really well to, I think, bring a bit of attention back to football in Edinburgh. And I think it's through what they've done that has actually helped do that, because they've brought a bit of atmosphere back to the grounds, but also they've brought a bit of passion back to what is ultimately one of the best derbies in football. Like the Edinburgh derby is brilliant. The areas that both Hibs and Hearts come from are fantastic. They both have their own identities and always have. But it's going to be overshadowed because of the old firm in Scotland, obviously, but a lot of people might look at Edinburgh and see it as a place for other sports like rugby or hockey or whatever, and not necessarily think about Hearts and Hibs. But what is stark to me as well with a lot of these ultras groups, especially in Scotland, even within Celtic and Rangers, is that a lot of the people within the stands don't necessarily agree or like the Green Brigade or the Union Bears, the Gorgie Ultras, Motherwell's Block E as well. And a lot of the ultras groups are actually, I don't know if hampered's the right word, but they certainly aren't on the same wavelength as a lot of the rest of the stadium for a lot of things.
Yeah.
And another really good example of that is Fair City Unity in Perth at St Johnstone, where they have this huge stadium. I think it's maybe 10,000 capacity, maybe a bit more. It's maybe like you're getting a couple thousand in at a time because they're currently in the Championship. And there's this little block of ultras in the corner. Again, young guys doing like stereotypically ultras things. And the rest of the stadium are like, oh, who are these wee guys? The drums are annoying, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, without them, there would be literally no atmosphere. You know what I mean? So it's interesting how there's this dynamic on the terraces kind of developing in Scotland as well, where not everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet. Everyone's quite happy to have them there because they create atmosphere. They make it intimidating, but when something starts going wrong, they turn on them quite quickly. It's very, very give and take.
I think also it's generational, because obviously you've got the old boys that probably don't like it so much. Young people who are influenced by social media see it elsewhere. Now that's how a lot of the stuff took off in Ireland in particular in the 20th century. People saw what was going on. Then also they travelled as well. So they're more open-minded as individuals. They're happy to experience football in other countries. And then they go, I want to recreate that here, because at the minute there's just like a few old men shouting abuse at the linesman. That's it. So it's like, want to create a bit of an atmosphere, And so yes, it is imitative, but at the same time it absorbs ultras. So if I think about Irish ultras, which came around sort of late 90s, early 2000s, yes, they've got some European style aesthetic and songs, but they've also got songs that we'd be familiar with in Britain as well, that they've always had from having watched the Premier League and various things like that. Likewise in Australia, I remember when I played there back in the early 2000s, and it was like, and also went and watched football, it was zero atmosphere. But when I went back 10 years later and went to a Sydney United match where Alessandro Del Piero was playing, which was great, it obviously changed, and you had a mixture of Italian aesthetics and Italian songs, but in English, along with other English songs as well. And it was basically like expats doing their year out working visa type thing, like I was at the back of the day, mixing with local Italian Australians who are trying to kind of recreate that atmosphere they're used to, and Croatian Australians and things like that, or that they see on TV and they want to sort of own part of and recreate in there. And it also differentiates them from other sports crowds as well, because soccer is a minority sport down there. And I use the word soccer deliberately in an Australian context.
Yeah, entirely fair. But what's interesting to me is that, there's so many dynamics that we can talk about within the ultras movements, and they all kind of come back to how we perceive like supporting our football club should be. How should you support your club? What is the standard of the club, and how are these people upholding it or, watering it down or whatever? But in terms of, I guess, where ultras actually came from, you mentioned earlier, Chris, the first hincha, Prudencio Miguel Reyes, who is considered to be the world's very first fanatic supporter and who was a fan of Nacional in Uruguay.
It goes back to what I was saying before. I'm sure people did shout and sing songs in British grounds and other, where it was working, men were getting together, and we know that was happening. But in terms of organised fandom, and he for some reason gets cited as the first hincha in South America. And there is a line that will follow through to ultras. This is where it's important to differentiate supporters from ultras. We're not talking about supporter culture necessarily, because there's always been there. Ultra culture is what we're talking about. And with Prudencio Miguel Reyes, he was the inflator of balls, the puffer, the hincha for Nacional. And going back to what I said about English football and British football starting out very upper class, it was the same in Uruguay. It was the British expats had introduced the game. They had upper class people going to the games with their top hats or whatever, the flag. And it was very much almost like a test cricket crowd atmosphere. But he would be running down the touchline going, Arriba Nacional, Arriba. So I try to generate an atmosphere. He's got a statue actually at the Gran Parque Central, which is a great stadium, a great historic stadium that I recommend everyone goes to Uruguay anyway at some point in their life. I'm lucky enough to be twice. And the Gran Parque Nacional is where the very first World Cup match was staged, because the Centenario wasn't ready. And so he's got a little statue there. And what happened with that is obviously he inspired the locals to differentiate themselves from the upper classes, I suppose. It came during the sort of awareness of the awakening of what was known as the criollos, a local born, often Italian or Spanish descent rather than Anglo or German expats, which were playing, the engineering class and the people that were building the railways and stuff that had the clubs. So they differentiate themselves, forced an identity for themselves, very much adopting local songs. This kind of spread also Argentina, Brazil. I think Argentina were the first ones to claim to have barras at San Lorenzo. I recommend Will Dalton's book, Oh San Lorenzo, which is excellent, covers the story of how San Lorenzo had the first kind of barras. And what happens is the watershed moment, as I said, they're all developing in isolation. Football cultures aren't necessarily talking to each other because globalization hasn't happened at this point. But 1950 World Cup, Yugoslavia go down to Brazil. A lot of the fans of Hajduk Split, which has just reformed after World War II, as everyone who's read my book, The Defiant, will know, it's very important to Yugoslav identity at this point. They saw the torcida, and they were like, "Oh, we like this. The torcida are making noise. They've got drums. You can imagine Brazil. It's got sort of sand beat, all that sort of thing." And they decided to make an organised fan group. Now they're not at this point weren't actually an ultra group. They're sort of recognised as the first organised fan group. Don't really see what we call now ultra groups until late 60s in Italy with the Fossa dei Leoni, the Lions Den at Milan, and Boys San, which are the Inter equivalent that followed a year later. And then you see other groups come like Fede in the very left wing, as you can guess from the name, on Roma, Irreducibile, Lazio later, and Brigata Gialli Blu. So what you're seeing here, you can see there's a sort of they've all got names like Commandos, Brigade, Brigata, Boys. They've got that sort of hooligans, sometimes supporters. They've got sort of English names because the hooligan movement was going around as well at this point, and they're sort of inspired by that. You see Andy Cap, for example, which is the cartoon character.
Of course, he's
massive in the ultra movement for some reason.
Love him.
Yeah, they do love him. And so you see this develop, and it catches on. So we go outside of Italy, Spain, for example, post-Franco, they start liberalising, and then people start seeing what's going on the terraces over there, and they, you get things like Bragadas Amarillas in Cadiz, coming around Cadiz. And it's quite interesting because I was in the 90s. I was actually, when I first came across ultras, I'm going to show my age here because the first time I came across ultras was in 1990 watching Transworld Sport on Channel 4. And I'll tell you what it was the Maximir riot of May 1990, because it was, this is where the ultras kind of first really, we talk about the conflux of politics and football. Delier of Red Star, quite famously had, Arkan, who was that, possibly one of the most violent ultras and infamous ultras in history. Whereas Dinamo Zagreb had the Bad Blue Boys as their, and there was this match between Red Star and Dinamo Zagreb, which was very famous in Zagreb. A riot breaks out, there's fighting, and Zvonimir Boban kicks a police officer when he's defending one of the Bad Blue Boys, who's taking a beating. So this is kind of people like to dramatize it and say this was the kick that started the Yugoslav Civil War. It wasn't. There was plenty of things going on that led to this moment. But yes, ultras, especially in the footballing context, it suits that narrative very well. So that's the first time I came across ultras. I was at university in Madrid in the 90s, and I was did a European Studies degree, and my dissertation was about football identity in Spain. Madrid-Barça was the case study. I lived 10 minutes down the road from the Bernabeu. But we are looking, this is the Ultra Sur there's a photograph I've taken. I don't know if you can see there. There's a Celtic
Yeah,
cross.
I can see it.
So
Yep.
there is
Yep.
far right aesthetic right there. For those who obviously listening, I've just shown an image of the Ultra Tour that I took in 1997. They were the Ultras that are now banned from Real Madrid, but they did have a right-wing aesthetic and, sang some terrible songs. But the interesting thing was at the very same week that I took that photo, I also went to Rayo Vallecano. And they have left-wing ultras, and the Bucaneros, which are quite famous now. They were only just starting to emerge at that point in the 90s, and so they were. I remember standing on the terrace with a few of them and thinking, "Oh, this is great! This is fun." Do you know what I mean? It's far less intimidating than it was going to Real Madrid and seeing those sort of like aesthetics. But
yes,
that does carry through. I mean, that's the thing. Ultras then, it's a known thing in Southern Europe. I don't think in the UK necessarily became that aware of them maybe until probably Euro 2012. I think it was in Italy and Poland, Ukraine and Poland. And I think people were talking a lot about Far East European ultras at that point. 2016, the Russians run amok in France a few times and a few other, Eastern Europe. I got stuck with some Hungarian ones, which was not very nice at Euro 16. I think this is where they sort of enter the consciousness here in the news anyway. But I think already in the wider consciousness, I'm talking about public consciousness, I think within footballing circles, we'd known about ultras since the 90s, watching Gazzetta Football Italia, whatever it happens to be your introduction to ultras, and been trying to replicate that at a level. Ireland been doing it, like I said, since the late 90s and 2000s with the Shamrock Rovers, SRFC Ultras. You've got Brigade Derg at Shelbourne, Notorious Boo Boys at Bohemians, and St Pat's have one, which they're going to SEI, Shed End Invincibles. That's it. So they're all kind of like have this sort of. I think they're obviously inspired to outdo each other. And social media has definitely accelerated that. Ultra culture now is like everyone knows it, right? That's part of the reason we go to Germany, go to Italy, because we want to see it. It doesn't happen here because the Premier League is quite sanitized. And I don't know, like in Scotland, but I imagine you also have issues with trying to get, flags, banners, and certainly flares into into a, football ground.
We've also got the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, which deeply criminalises football supporters to a different level in other parts of the UK. So there's an element to that as well, where our ultras kind of need to be especially careful about what they do. Not that they often do, which again, I don't agree with the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act. I think it's a lot of nonsense, but they still need to be quite wary of what they're actually able to do and what they can do in certain places. Otherwise, they can face jail time. It can be that extreme. But yeah, I mean, it's been amazing to see that from these roots how the ultras movement has grown kind of across the world, and I think especially Europe, but obviously our part of Europe as well. I'm struggling to think of the very first time that I actually kind of came across an ultras group. I feel like, because obviously having grown up watching Celtic and Rangers because of my dad and his family, I feel like ultras groups have always kind of been there. Do you know what I mean? So I struggle to think of a time or an identifiable moment when I can actually think that was the first time that I saw one, especially one outside of Europe. So it's interesting that you can point to that as your sort of origin for seeing the ultras movement, and I guess for people of that vintage. Sorry, Chris, that would have been quite a poignant moment, being able to see that, and then, as you said, going on to replicate it as well. And I think there is replicating it, but there's also understanding what ultras do, which are two entirely different things.
Yeah, and it's a broad spectrum, and that's the thing we don't really want. We obviously, like Alex will detest, as you said already, there's nothing to do with criminality. It's all about, in their case, it is for some in some places, and I'll do some reading at the end. But yeah, it's mostly about creating an aesthetic and doing something to bring some life to a Saturday afternoon, basically, or a Tuesday evening. That's what it is, isn't it, Alex?
Yeah, and I think one thing that's often overlooked is actually the impact of climate, perhaps, on the different styles of support that have emerged. Because if Chris was talking very eloquently about the history of the ultras movement, and a lot of these countries were slightly warmer countries and were periods where these stadia wouldn't have roofs. And anyone who's ever tried to create an atmosphere in kind of an open terrace will know it's very, very challenging. And that's why, anecdotally, it seems that a lot of these groups have sort of gravitated towards drums and megaphones. I remember reading an interview with one of the original Fossa de Leone at the San Siro in the era before they built that kind of amazing roof around it. And they couldn't get any chants going until someone brought some megaphones over from a political demonstration. And all of a sudden, they had this incredible atmosphere. Whereas England and Scotland, obviously much wetter countries, football grounds have traditionally had roofs. And I think that leads to a completely different kind of stage almost for the supporters to create an atmosphere, right? the Kop became famous in the 1960s, but it only became famous after they put a corrugated iron roof on it. And all of a sudden you've got this amazing kind of acoustic that fans can create noise with. And I think that's overlooked for me, the sort of the creation of two parallel but very different supporters cultures, essentially based on whether you've got a stadia with a big metal roof over it or not.
It's interesting. I've never actually thought about it that way.
Very good point.
But of course, there's the interest of the street bands and stuff in South America as well, which we shouldn't overlook. A lot of people have big drums that they use for church marches and stuff, and then it's not too much of a leap to go, oh, we're using this drum on a Sunday for church, so we bring it to the football on Saturday as well.
Get entire bands behind them as well, which is nuts. Like it's great spectacles, and you've mentioned there about the open terraces as well. But when you see that, everyone saw the videos of San Lorenzo fans, and it looks like they could literally fall off the stadium at any moment because there's so many of them. And they're coming in with entire brass bands behind them to create this atmosphere. Well, it's incredible.
That's the key thing. There's no health and safety. and that's the point. That is the key differentiator, because I'll ask Alex in a minute about this. But in South America, what I love about it is the lawlessness of it. You've got people hanging out of buses, on their way there, setting off fireworks just above your head. Yes, I mean, anyone can have an injury at that quite easily. Like you said, it'll fall off, and people do. But if you want to create an atmosphere, you have to strike that balance in the sort of, quite rightly, we have tough stadium safety laws here because of things that happened in the 80s. And so, yes, we've now got all-seater stadiums and some safe standing, great. We have to then work with clubs, and and the authorities have to sort of relax a little bit if they want to actually allow the conditions for an atmosphere to foster. You talk about South America, where they go in with entire bands, drums, umbrellas. It's very traditional for the borough to come in at last minute twiddling umbrellas. You certainly can get an umbrella, a full length umbrella into a ground, seen as a sort of weapon, I imagine. Drums, likewise. I'll ask Alex about, because you've got a drum. Long flag poles, for example. Do you actually have to work with the club to get permission to do this sort of thing? How do you go about that?
Dulwich, they're fine. We're at a lower enough level that I think everything's relatively relaxed. I know, as an example of what happens at a completely different end, I know that when Crystal Palace were playing in the FA Cup semi-finals and final last season, there was quite a lot of work done behind the scenes at Crystal Palace to liaise with the Homesdale Fanatics and with the stadium authorities at Wembley to make sure all the flags had their kind of, flame-proof certification, to make sure all the drums were allowed in and get all the permissions and all that stuff. You see that with the German clubs. Dortmund did a very good job of it when they came to Wembley for the Champions League final as well. So I think that, again, is something that people are just trying to figure out in England at the higher level, is understanding if you want these kind of amazing visual spectacles, which the clubs like, from a cynical marketing perspective. They're great brand building and marketing for these, big corporate football clubs. And I think they're just starting to understand that if they want that to happen within the framework of the rules and regulations in English football, they need to be actively working with the fans to kind of facilitate all of that box ticking that we need to do in this country.
I think we do need to let the fans run that. That's why I was desperate for Palace versus Forest final last year, because Forest have the Forza Garibaldi guys who do good tifo as well. And obviously Palace did the amazing tifo in the final with the guy with his two children, which is great. And that's because it's fan-led. And when you get a club-led one, can you remember when Arsenal dropped a little cannon down that time last season, was it? And it was everyone sort of laughed at it, really, because it's not really a tifo in terms of what we're expecting. And, it's kind of give us something, fan created, I think.
Yeah. And I think if you sort of put yourself in the perspective of these, corporate C-suite executives who are running big, serious football clubs like they're, international corporations and the billion-dollar businesses that they are, ultras groups are something really interesting and actually a real risk for people running football clubs, because on one hand, you've got a success story like the Homesdale Fanatics, who create an amazing atmosphere on the pitch, which I think everyone would agree helps the football team, but also makes Palace, a team that's not historically won a huge amount, used to be sort of stereotyped as the Nigels, a very historically, quote unquote dull football club who are now finishing in the middle of the Premier League. They feel really young and cool and vibrant. And certainly if I was a kid in London and I was looking which football team to support, I would be really gravitated towards what was going on at Selhurst Park. And they had a huge amount to kind of, again, to use the horrible kind of corporate words, but the brand and the marketing of the football club. But at the same time, there's a huge element of risk there, because if you're the football club leadership and you're letting these ultras kind of build and develop a presence on the terrace, you're really creating an alternative power centre, and you are naturally worried about, are they going to say something politically that the club hierarchy doesn't agree with? Are they even going to use their power and visibility to call for the chairman and the board to be sacked, as you see happen at Celtic? And I think the Ashburton Army at Arsenal is a really interesting example of this sort of push and pull within the football hierarchy. Because I think at the very, very beginning of their existence, when Miguel Arteta was trying to improve the atmosphere at the Emirates, there was a lot of support for the Ashburton Army and trying to give them a lot more space at the end behind the goal at Arsenal. But then there were some issues with them. I think there were some allegations that they were giving tickets away. I think they gave some away to Ajax fans, was the accusation. There were also some really serious accusations about anti-Semitism within the group, and Arsenal kind of rightly wanted to act on that. And now you've gone from a position where the Arsenal hierarchy is really supporting the creation of this ultras group to actually is almost smothering it in a way. And I think that really speaks to a lot of the push and pull within English football about the dynamic with organised supporters groups. And if we do see more of growth for them in the next decade or so, I suspect it might come from actually the Championship or lower down, where there's much more space within stadia, where it's much easier to fill a block with 100, 200 people, because there's just so little space in Premier League stadia to try and build a fan group out.
And I've seen that. Just on that note, I remember going to Stockport County because I happened to be in Manchester, and I met a friend who lives in Macclesfield. I was like, okay, let's go to Stockport County and see what's going on. It's a Friday night match. And it was quite interesting. But on the way to, I did not expect this at all. I had no expectation. I just expected to see a lower league match, League Two, whatever it was. And this was 3 years ago, I think. And they actually did a sort of German style walk to the ground behind a banner with some blue and white flares out, smoke going. And I was like, wow, this is quite cool, actually. Lots of flags. I didn't expect to see this in the lower league. So these things are happening in places, but they're very localized, and I guess you would see them on social media.
There was the Lionesses as well. The Lionesses tournament was big on fan marches recently.
Yeah, I mean, the Dutch led the way with that, didn't they, in many ways, which is a lot of fun. The point you're making, that the Premier League is quite old, just as in generationally, the average age of people that go to, because of the expense of it. It's very expensive to take kids, and there's a lot of tourists and things like that. So football at a lower level is far more accessible. And so if young people can afford to go to football at a low level and they see things that excite them, that can only be good for low league football and non-league football if the clubs facilitate it and work with fans to do that in a safe way.
That's true. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the TIFO at Arsenal, Chris, because there's this huge thing right now that's been spoken about in these new heritage things that are coming out recently, is this idea of authenticity, and it applies so well to football clubs, especially the Premier League at this moment in time. And the thing is, with club-funded TIFOs, obviously, and naturally, a lot of ultras movements will look down on them because it's like, well, it's not authentic because it's been made by the club. The club are going to want to produce a sanitised version of what we, the fans, perceive as the club actually being about. Therefore, it is not authentic because it's coming from the hierarchy and the top of the chain of the hierarchy. So this issue of authenticity, in a way, really nicely comes back to what ultras movements are about, which is kind of wrapping themselves around a really core set of values which is linked to the identity of the club and where they come from. Again, like Celtic is the best example that I can use, that the Ultras are very clear politically where they stand, but this is linked to Celtic's past as a team that was formed by the Irish diaspora who were forced out of Ireland by the famine. So you can apply that to other Ultras movements and see where their origins lie. And by looking at the history of football clubs, most of the time you can find the origins of the ultras movements, and by extension, again, not a blanket statement that all ultras movements are different. People believe different things within different movements, even at the same clubs. But for the most part, you can point to the origin of a football club and then find the origins of the ultras movements as well, and what they believe. And because of what they believe, that is what they will act on, and that's where their authenticity comes from.
But there are plenty of great examples as well now, especially in Eastern Europe. And Germany of great tifos and great, that fans here could replicate. So I'd like to see more of it, frankly. But I think you'll always get that resistance between traditionalists who don't see it as, not a British way to support football. But as long as there's sort of space for everyone, I suppose. If it doesn't take off, it doesn't take off. But
I think Alex is absolutely right, though. Like, what space have you got in the Premier League to invite a fan group in when you could sell that seat for hundreds of pounds to someone else? Why would you want to create a group of people in your own ground who are going to, from the off, be actively pretty against you? And again, this is from someone who isn't involved in the ultras movement in any way, so I'm happy to be corrected. But if you are identified by other ultras movements as basically a club-founded ultra group, then you've got no chance, basically, because that's not authentic. That's not what an ultras movement is. It's supposed to be organic. It's not meant to come from the club. It's very much meant to be, in my mind anyway, the representation of the supporters and the wider fan base, even if the wider fan base don't necessarily accept you as being a reflection of the club.
No, and I think in the Premier League, the fans that travel, away fans are always going to be the most hardcore, therefore the most creative in terms of songs and most passionate about the club. So I think if it should be led by them. But there is a reason I've only ever been to one Premier League match post-pandemic, and it was that Palace match, because I was fascinated by the timing of it with the FA Cup. Lucky enough to know members, but also, like I said, the Homestyle. I last saw them in, I think, 2019 or whatever. The game where Dele Alli did that amazing Gascoigne-esque goal against Spurs. That was the last time I'd been in the Homestyle end. They were just a few people with a few flags, and it's grown a lot since. And it's just great to see. I like it anyway. I'm not a Palace fan, but I support the idea of it.
Yes, I agree.
I think there's some really interesting stuff happening at the moment on the margins, often in the comment sections of Instagram and TikTok videos, because I think English fans, and I very deliberately say English fans, exist and have existed in a bit of a bubble for various reasons. There's the linguistic bubble of not speaking any other languages largely, but also a belief in that the Premier League is the be-all and end-all, and England invented football, therefore England had nothing to learn from other countries, which is a mentality that goes back a very long way in this country. And I think there's a lot of fans just not understanding the codes and the norms of ultras culture. And they turn on the Champions League and they see these amazing flags and they see these amazing tifo, but they don't understand the kind of rituals and the values that go behind it. What we're seeing a lot at the moment is Premier League clubs wanting to ape sort of the output of ultras groups and seeing these amazing displays and tifos. There was one example, I think it was Spurs recently, where it was on social media and all the comments were all these, continental Europeans saying, oh, well, it's just plastic. It's done by the club. And the English fans going, oh, we didn't realise that. Well, were we supposed to make that ourselves? That's totally new information to us. So it's kind of England fans catching up on the expectations of fan culture from the continent by just having continental people dunk on them in the comments of social media, which is interesting to watch.
2 points on that. One, I guess in Germany as well, you've got the 50+1 model. So fans have a far greater say over how their clubs are run. So I imagine it's easier for German fans to work with the club to create an atmosphere, etc. And two, it's interesting you say about how ultras influence each other. I was at Santander in the fourth tier of the Spanish football system in kind of the northern suburbs of Barcelona. And I heard very distinctively from Argentinian songs, but sung in Catalan. And it's quite interesting how songs from the terraces, because some Argentinians have moved to Barcelona, decided to pick a club, chose Santander, realised that if they want to get along regarding what I said earlier about Catalanismo, they learned Catalan and they taught the locals these particular songs, much of which very famous, Ole Ole Ole, which is quite famous, and then Mi Buen Amigo, which is traditionally the song that Argentinian clubs come out to. It comes from a 1980s advert, and traditionally your club will come onto the pitch to that song. But in this case, I heard it sort of midway through the second half. But either which way, it was, it's interesting to hear this sort of transatlantic influence in a different language. And that's because I think, like you said, Alex, there are probably a lot of fans on the continent far more open to other cultures and absorbing them and then tailoring them to their own requirements, in this case, Catalan.
Yeah, there's a really interesting, you could kind of design a flowchart of where a lot of these songs come from, where you get a lot of songs that might start in Argentina, and then because of cultural and linguistic links, they get adopted by Italian and Spanish clubs. But interestingly, in particular, the Italians strip out the syncopation and put it into a 4/4 marching beat. And then sort of English clubs hear that when they go abroad in Europe, and they get nicked and turned into English songs, which is where you get the weird kind of glorious memeing of Liverpool fans singing a song that's Si Senor based on an Argentinian pop song from the 1980s or the 1990s.
Yeah, and likewise, a lot of European terrorist songs are based on things like Yellow Submarine. I mean, it's another sort of English language songs. So it does kind of go both ways. I guess it was ever popular culture that you can then adopt. I mean, maybe Alex, you're one of the songwriters, one of the pensmiths at Dulwich Hamlet. What's the process? How do these songs get to the terrace?
Someone once described it to me as the shitty wall theory of songwriting, where you throw a lot of shit at the wall, and at the end of it, you end up with a shitty wall. I mean, I think it's what's so I can only speak for Dulwich, but what's quite interesting about our experience is there's an inverse correlation with how creative the fans are and how good we are on the pitch. If the team is doing really well, everyone's very busy watching the football and there's barely any creativity because we're all hyper into the match. Whereas if we're going through a period where we've got nothing to really fight for, the team's listless, but we're not going to get promoted, we're not going to get relegated, the beers start flowing and everyone sort of starts yes-anding each other and you get people coming up with a lot of silly songs. I think it's just, it's a sort of 100 flowers blossom situation. It's a lot of people try a lot of things. They go, oh, there's this silly song, maybe this would, or there's this pop song, maybe this would make a good football song. They get thrown around in a group chat, and it's kind of a marketplace of ideas. Some things kind of survive and become terrace anthems. Some get quietly and embarrassingly forgotten. But I think that's something that's always been specific about British footballing culture. Is there's this wonderful sense that anyone on the terrace can come up with a song, and if it's the right thing at the right moment, you could end up with several thousand people singing it. And I don't know if you've ever done that at a big football stadium, but it is an amazing thing to have tens of thousands of people singing a song that you started. And I think there's a real cultural attachment to that very democratic idea that kind of goes across the political spectrum. Left-wing, right-wing fans really like that romantic idea. I think English fans in particular are really resistant to the idea of having a capo with a megaphone, telling you what you should be singing, which is very interesting. And I think we're going to get something interesting and new happening in the terraces of English football over the next 10, 20 years as kind of the various rituals and codes and aesthetics of ultras culture from the continent seep into English football, but get transformed into something new because of the values and the democratic nature of English terrace culture.
That's exactly it. You mentioned democracy there. I don't think we'd like someone following one person's lead, one person's set list, so to speak. It's great that lots of different people can start up a song, and just true on brand to Dulwich as a place. Like I said, it's quite a nice leafy suburb. You got like tunes set to the Antiques Roadshow theme tune and things like that, haven't you? And what I found really nice, it's very topical as well. You had when the roundabout painting phenomenon started off in certain areas, there was a song about painting roundabouts, wasn't there, Alex, which is very on topic and at the time was very entertaining, I thought.
The referee from Chestnut, who paints roundabouts, I believe, was the song you're referring to, Chris.
Something like that, yeah.
Brilliant. I think this comes back to what we spoke about earlier, though, is that you say that, Chris, ultras movements are fluid. And within these different movements, you also have different cultural cross points, like with music, like with fashion, like with other things that are going on in society at the time. And these movements are always evolving and trying to do things differently. And over here in the UK, we often do try and do things our own way, regardless of how that comes off, whether it comes off or not. This is a kind of movement that interests me as the ultras movement, which is happening at the moment in the United States, because whereas a lot of European ultras, particularly Eastern European ultras, are perceived as being and are very right-wing, very right-leaning, and a lot of ultras movements in many ways tend to see themselves as being that. It's the complete opposite in the United States, where a lot of ultras movements that are springing up are actually left-wing, very anti-ICE, very pro-LGBT rights on the terraces. And it's interesting to see this. Again, I'd say the ultras movements in the United States are quite fledgling, but it's interesting to see how they are growing and developing in response to the circumstances that they find themselves in, like ultras movements did in Europe in the 50s and in Argentina and Brazil earlier before that.
Are you thinking of Portland Timbers in particular, with their guy that shaves a piece of wood off every time they score?
Not just Portland Timbers, Detroit City FC as well, Portland Hearts of Pine, another good ultras group.
Pittsburgh Riverhounds.
Yeah.
Where my sister lives. Yeah, that's they've got a nice little fan group going. But I think the problem with American, I compare it to the Australian model, which is probably lots of migrant cultures that kind of set, especially Latinos that go to football there. And I think in the current environment, probably reticent to go to public spaces like that. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting theatre of politics, I think, in the especially at the moment. But have you got any particular insights on it?
I mean, I think one of the things that I wanted to touch on was I'm almost reticent to call them ultras, because I think what we would probably traditionally see as being an ultra group probably doesn't apply in this case. Ultras live to a very strict set of code, even amongst themselves. There is often respect amongst ultras who have fought each other for decades. They often live in their own world, which is above the law, and do their own things. And that is part of the attraction to it for many young people over in the UK and in Europe as well, whereas in the United States, that element of it certainly doesn't exist. Not to my knowledge anyway. Not from what I've seen. It's very much terrace-focused and around creating a welcoming, friendly, and almost family-centred atmosphere as well. So it is different, but they certainly bring atmosphere and they bring noise. So whether or not you'd want to define them as ultras is different, but they are inherently a supporters movement and it could branch out into that. It's just interesting to see how they are developing in response to the circumstances they find themselves in. But, they are doing things a little bit differently. And there's almost this sort of thread of other football clubs who are doing similar. We spoke with Kit Holden a couple of years ago now about Union Berlin. And without speaking too much on their actual ultras groups, they are very much a club who don't want to lean politically any specific way. They're quite happy just to have a party when they're at the game and on the terraces, which, is a political decision in itself, but is doing things differently and how we would perceive ultras as doing things differently. The same, I think James Montague mentioned it about Atalanta and Amongst the Ultras, his book. You have these different movements springing up on the terraces, which often get defined as ultras, but might not be, but they could be in the future, if that makes sense. Very fluid.
Sometimes the fans have defined what the club identity is, like with St. Pauli, famously, probably. St. Pauli was just another football club for the first 70 years of its existence until the 80s, when suddenly a lot of left-wing fans moved in, disillusioned with what was going on at Harsval, or just because, standing up for squatters' rights and things. And they became the first kind of flagship left-wing ultra group, and they helped define the image of the club with the skull and crossbones and all that sort of thing. And you can see Rayo do similar kind of like vibes with them and the fans, but the difference being that the club doesn't necessarily embrace that, because there's always arguments with the leadership. So for some clubs they've kind of really lent into it, like St. Pauli, and others kind of haven't really. So it is interesting how some clubs are defining it. I think with Dulwich Hamlet have certainly worked very well with the leadership there, haven't they?
Again, with Dulwich, it seems to me that it's very much a case of not just being an alternative form of football, but being an alternative form of support as well. And I think that is quite important in the context of a discussion.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of give a bit of a background as to sort of, I guess, why I'm even here and sort of what my non-ultra credentials are. I'm a member of sort of two fan groups, organised groups at Dulwich Hamlet. There's the Pepper Army, which is a gloriously terrible pun, which was first formed or emerged, was accidentally created in 2022 to create an atmosphere around the women's matches. And then more recently, there's a group that's emerged called the Curva Car Wash, which is, again, a piss take of all the Italian groups calling themselves the Curva Nord and the Curva Sud. We have an end that's referred to as the car wash end because there's a car wash behind it. So the group's called the Curva Car Wash. And that was because there was a sense of, because at men's games at Dulwich, we get over 3,000 people regularly at a stadium that, quite frankly, cannot comfortably accommodate that many people. And we're in the process of building a new stadium at the moment. But we realised that if we were going to have any kind of atmosphere as we're swamped by all these people who are, maybe there for a chit chat, a day trip, again, they pay their money, they've got just as much right as anyone else to be there. But if we wanted to have the people who are creating an atmosphere together, we needed to organise something and actually have a group. And one thing actually that we learned is that from the Pepper Army is that if you create a group and you give it a name, it becomes a thing that people feel that they can join and be a part of. There's a danger if you don't do that you just seem like a group of mates who's a clique that are very uninviting and no one else can join. So that's why we did it. Would we call ourselves ultras or an organised fan group? I don't know. But I think we're on the list of these long sort of fringe groups, edge cases who may or may not be ultras. I think, interestingly, I got an email the other day. They're having a new singing section at Wembley for England international men's matches, which is interesting because I think it's a recognition that you need, in an age where we don't have freestanding terraces, you need to do some kind of organisation to get the fans singing together. So obviously that's not a full ultras type group, but that's a sort of level of coordination. So I think, and the work being done with the Lionesses as well to kind of organise fans and do marches before matches and sort of empower people who traditionally maybe haven't gone to football matches before to feel like they can noisily support a team. There's a lot of bits of ultras culture that are getting adopted without necessarily adopting the full thing wholesale, which is very interesting to me.
Yeah, no, it's good. And obviously there were the rabble before that, weren't there? I don't know if the rabble's still the thing. But no, it's great. I recommend everyone gets down there to Hamlet. It's only literally 3 stops from London Bridge. You're there in 15 minutes. And there's also a good big shout out to Clapton, obviously, as well. Like-minded club over in the east, quite near West Ham, actually. So if you want an alternative to the London Stadium, you'll get it in London's oldest stadium, the Spotted Dog, down in near West Ham Park.
They've got their own Italian ultras group as well at Clapton.
Yeah, Siamo tutti antifascisti, which is one of the shouts that goes up quite a lot. We're all anti-fascist. And there's also, I guess, good shouts out for Whitehawk down in Brighton. Lewis doing some really good things from a community point of view.
Chawton and West Didsbury.
Oh, yes, of course. Chawton, West Didsbury in Manchester, and Eastbourne Town have the peer pressure group.
St Roch's up in Scotland as well, who are one of our... They're formerly what would be called one of our junior clubs now, Scottish Non-League. Effectively, they sit at Tier 7, Tier 8. Based in the east end of Glasgow, up in what was formerly known as the Garngad, very much what would have been traditionally Celtic heartland, and where Celtic's all-time top goal scorer James McGrory started his career. They've named their park after him. A lot of Celtic ultras, Green Brigade and boys, have been defecting to St Roch's because of the state that Celtic have found themselves in. They see it as being a bit more of the experience of football that they want to consume. So I think there is an element of that coming up. But St Roch's have always had a great identity as being not the Celtic alternative, because they're not actively working to bring Celtic fans to them, but you get what I'm saying. They're the non-league equivalent almost, and they do some really good work within their community as well.
I mean, it's only going to certain of us want to do that. Most people just want to go to a football match to watch what's on the pitch. But, when I'm in Europe, especially, and in South America, I just hardly paying any attention to what's going on the pitch. I'm watching what's happening in the stands, and I wish that I like being part of it when it's there.
That's the thing. We always see on social media and on TV these giant curvas and all the sound and the noise, the light, the colour that's coming from them, these mass organisations of supporters. But people often forget that if they go 5 minutes from their doorstep, there's maybe a club that's trying to do something similar with a group of local lads. I think one great example from Scotland actually was Peterhead, who commissioned an old shipping container, got it cut up and turned into a shed end for their small burgeoning group of ultras, who now use it quite often to create noise and atmosphere at Peterhead. I mean, those guys have basically just banged themselves a group of future supporters for life. That's how you build your supporters base. That's how you build your community. And Spartans as well. Now, just for context, Spartans are from an area of Edinburgh called Pilton. It's quite a deprived area, but they have, I think it's a community officer, but he effectively works with these young people within Pilton, bringing them off the street and gets them to come to the football games. They get free tickets. It used to be a Lowland League side. Now they're in the SPFL 2. And for these kids, he brought them in and he said, look, for this match, we're going to make a tifo. And they made a pulley tifo of a Spartan warrior. This guy has basically got a group of kids through a youth initiative to create a tifo and create atmosphere that is as authentic as you like, because it's about the club. These guys will go on and do other things within Spartans. And I think that there is some really positive things that can come out of trying to replicate ultras movements and what they are without being traditionally ultras. Because, a lot of people will say that, oh, well, you're not an ultra if you don't fight every other week, if you're not involved in this, if you don't believe this, etc., etc. But actually, there's a lot of good things that can be done through replicating what ultras movements do. And there are a lot of good things that ultras movements do themselves. Let's not forget the amazing charity work that a lot of them do, especially around Christmas time, for food banks, for people who are victims of isolation and things like that. So it's not all doom and gloom with the ultras movement, but I think the point of this conversation largely was obviously to talk about their origins, the culture surrounding them, and really how we define them, because it's not, like we've said, it's fluid, it evolves often. I don't think it's necessarily clear anymore. It's not easily defined what an ultra or ultras movement is.
And also just say, whenever you're in a big town, quite often you go further down the leagues. In Paris, don't go to PSG, go to Red Star Paris. If you're in Hamburg, don't go to Hausfall, go to Alternate 92. If you're in Madrid, go to Rayo Vallecano. If you're in Barcelona, go to Europa and Sant Andreu. So, these are where cool things are happening. They're not necessarily in the mainstream. And that's a question of people like us trying to educate everyone else to say, hey, go and watch these clubs rather than going to the usual suspects. Alex was at Red Star the other week, weren't you?
I was. We had a lovely time. I think the call to action is really important, because a lot of the time you see sort of videos on social media and you get armchair fans going, "Oh, this is really cringe," because it's not 5,000 people taking over one end of the San Siro. But it's important to remember that every great iconic football group was once a dozen people mucking about having a go. And I have so much respect for all these kids, particularly in Scotland, who are going to football stadiums and seeing matches with a really sterile atmosphere. And they're not deciding to just moan. They're not deciding to stay at home. They're deciding to get off their backside, organise, and be the change they want to see in the world. And I think that's hugely important. Whatever football club you're supporting, whether it's a big club, whether it's a small club, get to know the other people at the football club. Try and make a positive change. Turn your football club into the football club that you want it to be. Don't just look all moony-eyed at the Dortmunds or the Milans of this world. Turn your football club into something better.
And just don't know if these groups are even still active anymore, but you had Young Sons, who were Dumbarton's young ultras group. You had Club 1948, who were at Stirling Albion. The Partick Thistle Ultras, they celebrated the year just towards the end of last year. They're doing a great job of bringing some atmosphere back to Firhill. So I think it's really exciting, the different movements that are emerging, especially in Scotland. It's interesting to see different ultras movements emerging that aren't based around necessarily scrapping with each other all the time. But I think importantly, it's just nice to see some authenticity coming back to football when we live in an era where football is constantly said as this massively sanitised and over-commercialised product. There's so much that's going on, like you said, Chris, especially within non-league and further down the divisions, which is great to see. And obviously, Alex, you're a part of that, and you know we can only commend you for the work that you guys are doing to actually make that happen and bring an alternative experience of football to people.
Thank you. And if any of your listeners sort of are based around London and would like to add to the vibes, at a Dulwich Hamlet men's game, you can always find us behind the goal. You probably find me lugging a drum around, moaning about having to lug a drum around. And for women's games, if that's more your vibe, we're in the poetically named toilet opposite stand, which is the tiny shed above the men's stand. So a shout out for Dulwich Hamlet men and women's games for anyone who would like to come and contribute to a party atmosphere at the football.
Yeah, just a reading list for anyone who wants to learn a little bit more on ultras themselves. 1312 by James Montague and Ultra by Tobias Jones, probably the go-tos. Football Fashions and Fandom, the Ultras of Italian Football by Alberto Testa, and Gary Armstrong is quite more academic look at football. And there's an Italian film called Ultra itself, which is about an aging Napoli fan who's kind of like trying to, get back in there. So definitely worth looking at. It's subtitled. I don't know, maybe one of your streaming channels. On early fandom, for those kind of before the ultra movement, Savage Enthusiasm by Paul Brown is a great look at the history of the football fan, particularly from a British perspective. And then We Lose Every Week by Andrew Lawn is the history of football chants. So how did these songs make their way to the terraces, club songs, etc.? So those are books on fandom that I would recommend.
Fantastic. I could also add the documentary Ultras of Egypt to that as well. Touches quite heavily on the ever-present war between the Ultras of Zamalek and Al Ahly in Egypt, especially the Port Said massacre, which was a tragedy which happened there. Highly recommend it as a good watch for anyone who wants to look at how Ultras movements behave and are policed in other countries as well. I think it's really important for that.
Yeah, I mean, Ultras in North Africa and Egypt, or in Morocco, and then over in Jakarta, Indonesia. Indonesia have got some crazy Ultras, but we didn't even have time to touch them. But yes, I mean, it's a global phenomenon.
Yes, exactly. I think that'll do us for today. Chris, Alex, thank you very much for joining me on this podcast, one of our first of 2026 so far. I hope all of our listeners enjoyed it as well. Thank you very much for tuning in once again. If there's anything that you want to ask about this episode, if you have any episodes to suggest yourself, please do get in touch. Best way to do that is by DMing us on any of our social media or emailing us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. But that'll do us for today. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.